Sometimes the people who laugh at you end up becoming the quiet reason you grow stronger. It sounds strange at first, but if you look closely at many stories of success, you'll notice something surprising. Before the success, before the confidence, before the recognition, there was almost always someone who doubted them, someone who laughed, someone who said, "You're not good enough." And oddly enough, those voices sometimes become the fuel. A few years ago, I came across a story about J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter. Today, her books have sold hundreds of millions of copies around the world. But before all of that happened, she was in a very different place. At the time, she was a single mother living in a small apartment in Edinburgh. She had very little money. She was struggling to raise her daughter. And during that period of her life, she began writing the story that would eventually become Harry Potter. But when she finished the manuscript and started sending it to publishers, something interesting happened. They rejected it again and again and again. 12 publishers said no. Some didn't even bother giving a detailed explanation. One simply told her that children's fantasy books weren't likely to sell well. Imagine hearing that. Imagine working on a story for years, only to have people tell you it's not worth anything. For many people, that would have been the end of the journey. But Rowling later said something that stuck with me. She said that during that time, she had already experienced failure in so many areas of life that she had nothing left to lose. And strangely, that gave her freedom. When people rejected the book, it hurt, but it also clarified something. She realized she was writing the story not because it was safe, but because it mattered to her. Eventually, a small publishing company decided to take a chance. The first print run of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was only 500 copies. 500. Today, the series has sold more than 500 million books worldwide. And when people look back on the story, those early rejections seem almost unbelievable. But maybe they were part of the journey. Maybe they were the pressure that helped shape the diamond. There's something interesting about criticism. Sometimes it's destructive, sometimes it's unfair, but sometimes it forces you to ask a deeper question. Not, are they right, but why am I doing this in the first place? Because if the answer is clear enough, the criticism loses its power. When I think about this idea, I'm reminded of something Steve Jobs once said during an interview. He said that the moment you start trying to live someone else's expectations, you begin losing the clarity of your own path. Jobs himself faced intense criticism during his career. In fact, in 1985, he was fired from Apple, the very company he had founded. Imagine building something from the ground up only to be pushed out of it. For a while, many people believed his career was over. Some newspapers even described him as a talented visionary who had simply gone too far. But years later, when Jobs spoke about that moment, he described it in a very different way. He said that being fired from Apple was one of the best things that ever happened to him, because suddenly the pressure of success was gone. He was free again, free to experiment, free to create. During that period, he started 2 companies. One was called Next, the other was Pixar. Pixar would later go on to produce some of the most beloved animated films in history, and eventually, Apple bought Next, which brought Steve Jobs back to the company he had once been removed from. Years later, Apple became the most valuable company in the world. But the turning point of that story wasn't success. It was the moment of rejection. This pattern appears again and again. Someone doubts you, someone laughs, someone says you're not capable, and for a moment, you might believe them. But if you look at the lives of many remarkable people, you'll notice something. Those voices didn't define them. Instead, they clarified something inside them. They helped them realize what truly mattered. Sometimes the people who criticize you think they are limiting your potential. But what they don't realize is that they might actually be sharpening it. Because criticism forces you to confront a difficult question. Do I truly believe in what I'm doing? If the answer is no, you walk away. But if the answer is yes, something interesting happens. You keep going. Not because the path is easy, but because something inside you refuses to stop. And perhaps that's the quiet truth behind many stories of resilience. The people who laughed at you may never understand the role they played, but their doubt becomes a kind of unexpected gift. A pressure that forces you to grow stronger than you were before. So the next time someone dismisses your idea, or questions your ability, or quietly assumes you won't succeed. Maybe the real question isn't whether they're right. Maybe the real question is this: what will you do with that moment? Will it stop you? Or will it quietly push you forward, one step further than you thought you could go? There's another story that often comes to mind when people talk about persistence. It's the story of Thomas Edison. Most people remember Edison as the inventor of the light bulb, but what many people don't realize is how many times he failed before that moment. When Edison and his team were experimenting with the electric light bulb, they tested thousands of different materials for the filament. Again and again, the experiments didn't work. The materials burned too quickly, or they broke under the heat, or the light simply didn't last long enough. At one point, a journalist asked Edison a question that probably sounded reasonable. He asked him, "How does it feel to fail 1,000 times?" Edison's response was surprisingly calm. He said something that has been repeated for more than a century. He said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Think about that for a moment. Most people see repeated failure as proof that something is impossible, but Edison saw it as information. Every failed experiment was simply a step closer to understanding what might actually work. Of course, not everyone around him shared that perspective. There were critics, people who believed the project was a waste of time. Some even mocked the idea that electric light could replace gas lamps. But Edison kept experimenting, day after day, night after night, until finally, in 1879, the team produced a filament that could burn long enough to make the electric light bulb practical. That invention changed the world. Cities that once depended on gas lamps slowly transformed into places filled with electric light. But if you look closely at the story, the invention wasn't the most interesting part. The mindset was. Edison refused to let the opinions of others determine the direction of his work. Instead, he focused on the process, and that focus allowed him to continue long enough to reach a breakthrough. There's something powerful hidden in that approach. When someone criticizes you or laughs at your efforts, the instinct is often to defend yourself, to prove them wrong immediately. But Edison seemed to understand something deeper. He didn't need to win the argument. He only needed to continue the work. Because time eventually reveals what criticism cannot: results. And that idea raises an interesting question. What if the goal isn't to silence critics? What if the real goal is simply to keep moving forward long enough for your work to speak for itself? When you look at history, many people who were once mocked eventually became the people who changed the world. Not because they fought every critic, but because they stayed focused on what mattered most: the work.
And sometimes the people who doubted you the most are simply responding to something unfamiliar. When someone chooses a path that others haven't taken, it creates discomfort. People naturally prefer what they understand, but progress rarely begins inside comfort. It usually begins with someone willing to continue despite uncertainty. And perhaps that's one of the quiet lessons behind Edison's story. Not every criticism deserves your attention. Sometimes the best response is simply quiet persistence. Let the work continue. Let the results arrive in their own time. There's one more story that captures this idea in a powerful way. It's the early story of Michael Jordan. Today, Jordan is widely considered one of the greatest basketball players in history, but his journey didn't begin with recognition. In fact, it began with rejection. When Jordan was a sophomore in high school, he tried out for the varsity basketball team, and he didn't make it. The coach believed he wasn't ready. For many young athletes, that moment might have been the end of the dream. But Jordan later described that moment as one of the most important experiences of his life. He said that after being cut from the team, he went home and cried. Then the next day, he started practicing harder than ever before, day after day, hour after hour. Jordan later said that he practiced as if every single shot mattered, because in his mind, he never wanted to feel that kind of disappointment again. Eventually, his skills improved dramatically. He made the team the following year, and from there, his career continued to grow until he reached the NBA. Years later, Jordan reflected on his career in a way that surprised many people. He said, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over again in my life. And that
If you look back at all these stories, there's something quite interesting. The people who once mocked you sometimes end up becoming an unexpected part of the journey that makes you stronger. Not because they helped you, but because they challenged you. They forced you to face an important question. Do you truly believe in the path you're walking? If the answer is no, you'll stop. But if the answer is yes, then every bit of criticism simply becomes a small obstacle along a much longer road. And perhaps that's why many successful people later say they don't hate the ones who once doubted them. In fact, some of them are even grateful, because those moments forced them to become stronger than they were before. So, if one day you hear doubt, criticism, or even laughter behind your back, remember one simple thing. It may not be a sign that you're on the wrong path. Sometimes, it's simply a sign that you're walking a road not everyone has the courage to take. If these stories gave you even a moment to pause and reflect, then perhaps they have already served their purpose. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and wherever your path leads, I hope you continue walking it with persistence and with courage.